You'll also need a supervisor who wants you to clone a suspect's pager, knowing that it might lead to who knows what else. Pen registers, wiretaps.
Daniels will come round.
Daniels will have your ass.
Alex Cottrell and Toby Huntingford present Caught on the Wire. This podcast is an episode-by-episode analysis of HBO's widely acclaimed TV series about the city of Baltimore, its people, and its many problems. Find more information about the show and all the episodes online at caughtonthewire.wordpress.com.
Hello, welcome to Caught on the Wire. I'm Toby Huntingford, joined today by Alex Cottrell. How you doing, Alex?
Yeah, I'm feeling ready for this episode.
Excellent. Well, today we're going to be bringing you some analysis and discussion for episode 3 of season 1 of The Wire, entitled The Buys. And if you have stuck through with us from the first 2 episodes, I want to thank you very much because, as you may be able to tell, I'm sounding a lot more healthy. I've finally spent some cash on a proper microphone, and
we've emancipated the quality of your voice with a new headset.
That's how it's done. That's how it's put.
Quality investment in the podcast, that is.
Absolutely, it really deserves this kind of investment, and it wasn't too bad. And I did listen back to the first 2 episodes, and I think I might have understood about half of what I said. The rest of it sounded like some sort of strangled cacophony of cats, if I'm honest. So thank you very much for putting up with it. I'm sure it wasn't the most pleasant experience. But today, things should be a lot more fluid and smoother and easier to understand. So with that out the way, actually, we'll quickly go back to something we went to last week. I think Alex made a reference to a video called Style in the Wire, a video essay.
Yeah, that's right.
We kind of attributed it to some guy on the internet, which is not a very good thing to do when you're podcasting. So we're going to go back and give credit where credit is due. And if you do want to check out that video of Style in the Wire, which I heavily recommend you do as well, it's Erlend Lavik, who completed it as a project at the University of Bergen in Norway. So there you go. Just if you fancy checking it out, go for it. And in the future, we'll make sure to credit everything we reference properly on the spot. So
do our research.
With that said, yeah. Should we jump into it then, Alex?
Yeah, let's go with that.
You're going to recap us today.
Yep.
Right. Okay. So what happened this week, Alex?
So in episode 3, we open up with D'Angelo questioning attitudes towards the junkies, as the other kids show a little bit of disrespect for them. They're just drug fiends. And then Bubbles arrives and kind of demonstrates a similar theme with this kind of non-violence, because he's obviously doing the hat game for the detail. So we see him put the red cap on D'Angelo, and Kima is snapping some photos. Then we move on to the fallout from the blind kid incident from the previous episode, where Prez obviously whips that kid with his pistol, and they decide to go on a bit of a raid around the towers for no obvious reason other than a bit of catharsis. And we see the chiefs talking about shielding themselves from indictment with the criminal histories of the witnesses. So we kind of see a bit of power play on the hands of the police chiefs here, and we see the continued lack of empathy. And Prez's guardian angel, Valchek, who is introduced in this scene, and he is am I getting this right? Is Prez's uncle?
Not quite. He's Prez's father-in-law.
Father-in-law, that's it, yes.
So clearly Prez is providing for his daughter, and that
right.
gives him a strong interest in keeping him pretty in the department.
Yeah. And we see Valchek as not a particularly... He's probably amongst the worst of the police chiefs that we've seen so far. Burrell describes him as a necessary evil. Then we cut to a rather bogus conference where Bunk and Rawls are denying that the death of Gant was actually related to him being a state's witness. Obviously, we as the audience know that this is kind of a load of rubbish, but it's just on TV, and we see McNulty lamenting the fact that Bunker's converted to the dark side, as it were.
Classic McNulty.
Yeah. McNulty, who is obviously down in the sort of the cellar for the detail, he gets the ever-useless Polk and Mahone to go and look for a photo of Barksdale because they don't have any information on this guy and not even a photo. Manages to persuade them to go and look for one. I think they go to the housing department, don't they?
That's right. That's right. The housing department, who for some reason spew out a middle-aged white man back at them. We never quite know whether that's Polk and Mahone's incompetency or the housing project's incompetency. But either way, it's not particularly useful.
Yeah. So. Following them disappearing off, we have the famous chessboard scene, which involves Wallace, Bodie, and D'Angelo. And D'Angelo giving them an analogy of the game, talking about how the chess pieces relate to various figures within the drug trade, and we kind of learn this and see this as Wallace and Bodie do. Then we obviously have Sydnor, who is trying to go undercover and get some buys, kind of see if he can see where the money is coming from by actually doing an undercover drug buy. And we see him sort of with his gear and trying to look like a drug fiend. And we see Bubbles schooling him on what he should be doing. We also see that Santangelo is the inside man for Rawls in the detail. And we see that he's having his loyalty bought for favours, we assume, down the line. And then following that, we see obviously Polk and Mahone return with that photo of the white middle-class man that we see. So they continue to be completely useless. Lester comes alive a lot in this episode. We see him go from being almost completely silent to going to look for a photo of Avon, hopefully successfully this time, at a boxing Golden Gloves place. I believe it's called Golden Gloves. Or that's the name of a competition, perhaps. Lester, for whatever reason, seems to know about this, and he travels there and he's able to get hold of a photo of Avon Barksdale from his boxing days. Fitzhugh from the FBI, who is obviously friends with Jimmy, is able to get a proper sort of undercover wiretap, or not wiretap, sort of undercover microphone that Sydnor is able to use in his undercover drug buy. Oh god, there's just so much in this episode, isn't there? This is why I hate doing these recaps, because there's just too much stuff.
Definitely. We've covered most things.
Yes.
I think the raids and Omar are the two big ones.
Yeah, the last two major things are the we obviously have the introduction of Omar, and we see him eyeing up the stash, and that eventually results in him doing a raid, and his partner Brandon reveals his name, which obviously leads the Barksdale organisation onto Omar later on. And then the last thing was the police raid. And that doesn't exactly go to plan, because both Daniels and McNulty and pretty much everyone know that it won't really achieve anything, and they do actually end up with pretty much nothing, which is quite amusing.
Although there is that one silver lining, I believe. Does Freeman find D's page number, or at least a D's page number?
Yeah, he finds a page number. Yeah.
Not that he's going to let anyone know about that, but
yeah.
We know that this man is clearly a silent, strong type.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think the raids really show that, next to Omar's raid from the previous night, clearly show how incompetent the police really are. That they've spent all this time gathering intelligence, and Omar literally had to sit down for half a day, and is clearly got one on them really. So
well, with that in mind, let's depart the recap and get on with the actual discussion.
Let's go. Okay, so shall I start?
Yeah, go for it.
I'll kind of divulge what I think is my common theme, or the common theme that I think the episode seems to have, and that it tends to highlight all the lapses in the police's knowledge. So it shows us how kind of we assume the police are very effective as a deterrent against drug dealing, and this is challenged all over the shot. And we see that the playing field of drug dealers versus police is at the very least level, particularly with motivated police like McNulty and Greggs, although it's probably tipped in the drug dealers' favour, and they appear to be more motivated and cautious at every stage. So we have, for example, like Sidner learning that the favoured policing technique of hand-to-hand drug buys won't be capable of allowing them to get close to anyone in the organisation that matters, and we therefore see that the drug hierarchy is effective and well insulated at the top. The chess scene also reinforces this. We see D'Angelo schooling Bodie and Wallace about how the drug game has been rigged so that only the pawns or bottom feeders are vulnerable. And this is a concept that Bodie in particular struggles to understand. We also see Bubbles schooling the detail and the nuances of the street in that great scene where I think that the two great things in that scene are the dead soldiers on the shoes, where we really get a sense that this culture has its nuances that no one else could really understand unless you live through it. There's also the great wedding ring line, where Sidner just assumes that he can keep wearing his wedding ring because that's what married people do, but if you really want to get in tune with the street, you have to understand that that's all that is to a street person is something you can pawn for another hit. And Bubbles delivers that quite nicely with, "Shit, you married to the needle, boy." So I did enjoy that. And it's a great scene for both the audience and the detailers. They learn a lot about the street and how little they know about it.
It's if I might add, it's a curious, almost romanticisation of the life on the street. And we see, especially in the scene with Bubbles, and the way he talks about it and the way they kind of learn this information. And you were saying it kind of gives a certain appreciation for the culture behind being a drug fiend, I guess.
Yeah,
it's a strange romanticisation of it. I think that's the right word.
Yeah,
like it's just I don't know,
it's like
to put your finger on.
Absolutely, it's like you get the impression that David Simon understands it because he obviously lived through it. I think when he wrote the Corner book back in the early 90s, I think it was. I mean, he lived on these corners and he clearly understood all the culture. And I guess it's something that people never really talk about or notice or even write down. So he clearly wants to kind of show that there is this culture that's very different and that people live by and appreciate, but no one really talks about it in the mainstream world. So it's nice that he's bringing it up, as you say.
Yeah, it's a good example of The Wire demonstrating that there is a certain agenda to its creation. It's not just there. I mean, it's obviously very entertaining, but it's also trying to reveal, like you say, when we were talking about it being the show in general being quite voyeuristic and having this fly on the wall sort of documentary-esque feel in a way. It's doing that also by revealing certain things about the way the situation is and what it wants to teach people. And for example, with this talking about the romanticisation of the drug fiend culture, it's not something that the average person might be considering. They just they're drug fiends, they're just wasters or whatever. Yeah. I guess it's trying to encourage a particular mindset towards the problem.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's very good. Like in the same way that dog crap might infest the street of a wealthy kind of suburban area, here it's just dead soldiers, like dead vials, and that's just something that people accept and live with, but you wouldn't really think about until you actually have to walk down one of these streets. So yeah, it's a very good point. In terms of other ways that the police learn that they're not really capable of catching these drug dealers, this is less the police learning and more us learning, but we see obviously Omar introduced as the all-seeing eye who sits in his van very silently watching things and getting his subordinate Bailey to note things down in a notepad.
Yeah.
And we even see that he's so cautious and observant that he identifies the police are actually carrying out their own surveillance. So it almost becomes like a three-tiered surveillance, with Omar surveilling the police, surveilling the projects.
Yeah.
And we see that Omar is just an incredibly patient man. And when he does strike, he comes up trumps, unlike the police. And then through this, we also learn that the process of the Hoppers having to constantly move the stash houses. And this is both through the chess game, which is the castle piece, where the stash house is the castle piece, and also when Omar spends his time keeping his eye on that stash house and making sure he notes every change as the house moves. And then I think that pretty much covers all of them. I think there's a couple more minor ones. For example, Fitzhugh in the final scene doesn't has clearly an inexperienced patrolman, we'll go with, because he turns up at the wrong side of McNulty's car and has to adjust himself, showing that for all his techno gadgets and wizardry in the office, he doesn't really have much practical policeman skills when it comes down to the streets. So all of these aspects kind of speak to an ingrained level of discipline with the drug dealers that certainly comes as a surprise to the audience and the Baltimore Police Department, who occupy kind of an assumed intellectual high ground. So that was kind of my take on what this episode showed. Did you have a different one, or do you broadly kind of agree with that?
In terms of the overall theme?
The overall theme, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable analysis. Like, I think money plays a big part in this as well. Like, the scene where I really like the scene with where we see Stringer at the back of Orlando's club with all the money, and he's obviously doing his business. We sort of see his business sense, and him talking about, it's the same product. They're just going to rebrand it basically. And we start to see a lot more of the money and a lot more of the business. And but other than that, I think, you're pretty much right. We see inconsistencies and a lack of knowledge on the part of the police. But we also see a sort of naivety on both parts as well. Like, we see Bodhi's naivety towards the chess analogy. For example, he seems quite certain that, a smart pawn could get to the top. But that's not what it's about. The chess analogy is there because chess is unchangeable. It's rigged, and there are key players, and irrespective of what strategy you might have, there are sort of overall truths to the game that will always be that way. Regarding what you were talking about with Omar, if we treat this chess analogy as it is, how does Omar factor in? What piece is he?
He almost, I mean...
Is he a brand new piece? Are we to expect there's some kind of like house rules version of chess where Omar is a piece?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because David Simon often refers to the Greek tragedy as the kind of the source of the wire. And there's that technique in there, the Deus Ex Machina. I think David describes that as the hand that moves the pieces, or the gods that come in and destroy things. And those gods are referred to by Burrell, I think, in season 3, when he says the gods will not save you, it's Baltimore.
Well, it's Latin for God made the machine.
Yeah, that's right. So it's kind of the idea that God comes down and destroys things. There's some sort of origin behind it, isn't there? I'm not too well versed.
I think it's God made the machine anyway. I'm sure there might be some sort of someone who's listening to this who knows their Latin very well and is cursing at me right now. And if that is the case, then curse away.
There we go. Let us know. Let us know if we've butchered it. But I think you could argue that Omar almost occupies that place, perhaps not from this episode, but as the show goes on, we learn that he is almost a force of nature who's so cautious with what he does that he can change the game to his own style, really, or to his own fitting.
He is a little bit. You say he's a force of nature. Like, he is a little bit like a natural disaster, because wherever he goes, people just run away.
And you kind of
people
have
just
that
escape. They batten down the hatches when they see him. Like, he's like a hurricane.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think the duster coat works really well there as well, because obviously the duster coat's always kind of blowing in the wind, almost as if he's sort of working his way down the street as this big gust of wind that's going to blow everyone to pieces.
There's definitely a western sort of frontier element to him as well, like, kind of like Lone Ranger.
Definitely, no. He's an unusual character, because I mean those things sound quite cliched and kitschy, but I mean for most characters in the show, there's no kind of attempt at doing that. But Omar kind of really deserves that treatment with his duster coat and his force of nature, kind of hyper realistic nature. So
he almost has a kind of comic book
well.
Character edge to him.
Yeah,
in a way.
Yeah, definitely.
I was going to add about Omar actually that. There is kind of something about his appearances in this episode that is kind of, we don't really see it in the same way again because of what he does in the episode. But we see Omar in his kind of what is supposedly meant to be sort of early days before he becomes a local legend. And there's a lack of mythos surrounding him. It doesn't feel like the show is kind of reveling in, oh, look how clever this character is, what kind of snarky thing can we get them to do this time?
Yeah.
It feels like we are seeing someone who is vulnerable, but is at the same time still calculated, and, you know, we see this sort of drug bust, and we see that he's ruthless, and, you know, we kind of get to know the character in this way. But because there's no mythos surrounding him at this stage, something about it was inherently more satisfying for me, I have to say. It following, you know, the rest of the series, he is almost like evangelized to this kind of, like, you know, brilliantly neutral hero in a way, like sort of daring, and he's dangerous and everyone runs away at the sound of his name. Like, because this episode doesn't really have that, it was kind of a bit more satisfying for me personally.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I definitely picked up on that. I was going to mention that as well for a slightly different reason.
I know that you have a major plot-related grievance, which I think is extremely justified.
Excellent. No, but yeah, absolutely. I remember watching this for the first time, and Omar, you definitely see him so differently the first time round. You just see him as this other kind of side of the coin on the street, some other small level crew that wants to make a little bust.
We've seen this before, haven't we? We've seen these massive characters, introduced so nonchalantly. Like, here they are, new character.
Yeah.
Like, there's no kind of entrance scene. It's just a scene, and he happens to be in it.
Yeah. He's actually an appendage to the Sidna drug buying scene, isn't he? He's just like the camera pans around different parts of the courtyard, and
it's not his scene in any way.
Yeah,
like,
exactly. That's again, it just speaks to the way everything is just kind of so matter of fact in The Wire, and it's just the way life is lived. There's no kind of grandstanding. So, absolutely. But yeah, I think that sense of mythos is.
If I sorry to interrupt again, but I was going to add that
please do.
That can make it more disorienting, though. That's something that can be said about the show, I think. Is that because it is, like you say, because there is no grandstanding, especially as a first-time viewer, I mean, it does make it disorienting, because it doesn't have as many of those sort of pillars of TV storytelling that one becomes so accustomed to, and thus you miss a lot. I mean, that is just a fact of The Wire. Like, watching the show again as we do this podcast. I mean, I've seen all these episodes 5-6 times now, and there's still stuff I'm going, oh, I hadn't seen that before. And you remember when you watched it the first time before that, it just, you know, glazes over you. I mean, that's a good thing. It rewards repeat watches, but for first-time viewers or for immediate viewers, like, it demonstrates that it's brilliant to have this casual, sort of inconsequential introduction of major characters and whatnot, but it does make the show disorientating.
Absolutely.
I keep saying disorientating.
That's more like it. I mean, I think it just depends whether you consider the show not being built for the first time viewer is a negative or not. For anyone who is only going to go and watch it once, it probably is. But as we can see, we're now podcasting about it, having seen it a few times, and the show is immensely richer for that fact that it doesn't make itself clear on the first time. And I think these scenes with Omar just kind of epitomise that, really. Absolutely. Should we? Is there anything else you wanted to say about that, or should we quickly move on to the other side of the mythos with Omar?
No. If you want to move on to the next discussion point, we shall.
Yeah, definitely. So, you said that the mythos was refreshing for you, or the lack of mythos, at least. Yeah. So Omar becomes this other sort of thug on the street who wants some drugs and clearly knows what he's doing, and comments on how raggedy the performance is in the pit. But for me, when you equate Omar into the wider Wire picture, it doesn't quite add up here, really, for me. And what was it? So you could tell kind of his role at this point in the show, as it was being written, was kind of a bit all over the place. So Omar, the main point was that he was concerned about Brandon speaking his name during the drug bust. Omar gets very, very annoyed and tells Brandon to shut up. And you can see that they try and cover their tracks here in the next episode. I'm sure we'll get to that next week. But Omar tells Brandon that he was only worried about his name being said because he thought that would be able to come back on Brandon. It would keep Brandon safe.
That seems more like a setup for what happens later on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
justifying its own story rather than the events.
Yeah,
or its own planned story, anyway.
perhaps they tried to kind of merge the two together so that they could set up the Brandon kidnapping arc, whilst also fixing the whole Omar doesn't like having his name rang out in the streets thing. But I don't think it quite makes sense. I don't see why Brandon would need to worry about that, or why Omar would need to worry about that. I mean, his name is there. You also have earlier in this episode.
What, you mean you don't
Bubbles.
know why they would need to worry about them hearing his name?
Yeah, it's kind of what Omar embodies. The idea that he's in the street and that everyone knows he's there and he's a force to be very much feared.
I guess so, but at that point, it isn't the case. And once his name gets out there, I guess he has to accept it, doesn't he? He has to be like, well, that's the way it is now. Like.
The problem is Bubbles in the episode earlier when he's talking to Greggs, tells Greggs that he's been ripping and running out here for years. And since we know that the Barksdales have controlled most of West Baltimore drugs for about a year, or more than a year, it seems very unlikely that they wouldn't have come across him in all that time. So I just didn't
maybe
think
hadn't heard his name up to this point.
Nobody
Nobody ever really identified him.
Yeah.
I mean, it's difficult. It's always going to be based on kind of like conjecture in a way, because we don't know what he's at. We have these sort of snippets of information that build a part of a picture, but I guess it's always difficult to say because you don't really know what the story is intending to have said that he's been doing up to this point. I mean, it's not information that's even revealed to the audience in any way. So
no, not at all. I mean, it's when they try to later on in a few episodes down, they try and establish the whistling as kind of a long-term sign of fear in the neighbourhood. I mean, that they clearly there's a little bit of disconnect between what happened here and what Omar becomes very shortly. So there's clearly some growing pains with the writing, I think, but otherwise Omar becomes a very strong character for me. Because
another perspective on that might be that they might see it, a viewer might see that and just instead see it as he's suddenly become very sort of infamous and feared, and it's happened really, really quickly, basically because of one raid that he did. And it kind of seems like his name explodes onto the street all of a sudden. Like, it does seem to be, that's another way it could be perceived.
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. I'm sure there's plenty. But
that's not justified either. I mean, that would still be poor.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just, for me, considering that the Barksdales have dominated the West Side drug trade for more than a year, the only acceptable explanation for me is that this raid in this episode is the first time it actually targets the Barksdales, which, it's feasible, but you'd have thought that they'd have known what their adversaries are from this point onwards. So that was kind of my take on the Omar this time round. Okay. That's perhaps one of the critical elements of this episode. I'd perhaps call it the Wire's biggest plot hole, and the Wire's doesn't really do plot holes, as we know, but that's why this one kind of stands out the most, just as a little lapse in the writing.
Well, I guess it demonstrates that that the show still had to mature as it was going along. And there's another example of this where after McNulty goes to see Perlman, and obviously initially it's about cloning a beeper, but then they end up having sex. Most incredibly, like the sort of the weird scene where they're like both sort of breathing and they're exhaling at the same time after sex, and it goes on forever. It's like a really long scene. You're just watching them like going both at the same time, and it's just feels like it goes on for hours. Like it's a really strange shot.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But the bit that I was going to talk about in that scene is that we have another McNulty, what the fuck did I do? And it's like they're still continuing on that element of catchphrase in McNulty, which I think I mentioned before was a bit not very tasteful for The Wire, and it demonstrates that that does get phased out. There's still elements of The Wire that need to be properly polished as it goes along.
Yeah. I did actually quite like that use of the catchphrase, though, because it was in a different context than most of them, in this kind of idea that there was this sort of sexual tension that wasn't quite resolving itself, and then it did, and then McNulty got blamed for it, and I thought, that's quite nice. It kind of speaks to McNulty's endless flaws. Yeah,
it was as sort of any use of catchphrase in this show goes, that was definitely sort of one of the better ones, maybe the best.
Yeah, definitely. Can we quickly go back to that stringer scene
Yes,
that you mentioned? Because I definitely always enjoyed this scene.
This is one of my favourite scenes in the episode.
Yeah, it's definitely cathartic to see D'Angelo, get recognised for what he's doing in the pit after all the struggles he's been through recently. And you kind of it's hard to not get excited about all the money that's going on in that room. And despite what the nature of their work is, it's kind of a very nice eye-opening into the upper scales of this business, and the fact that Stringer's just sat there with his suit, and that there's no room for this kind of street politics at this level. It's all just cold hard cash. But it was funny to kind of contrast Stringer's impression of D'Angelo's performance with Omar's, because Omar was taken aback by how sloppy the pit deal drugs, and the idea that Poot doesn't know how to be inconspicuous about moving stash houses, and they're lining up all their fiends for tasters around the corner, and that there's no idea of keeping it on down low. Whereas Stringer sees the cash flow at the end and is very impressed with what's happening. So I think it speaks to the idea that
Stringer's got money on my mind.
Exactly. And that there's again a disconnect between what people think they know and what they don't know. And Stringer is on the edge of Stringer's on the edge of experiencing a lot of issues with the pit in upcoming episodes. And at this point, he has no idea of what's about to happen. So, I thought overall that was a very nice scene.
Yeah, it's an excellent scene. It's just nice to see a bit of sort of his business sense as well, and the idea of rebranding. It's just maybe not something. Again, going back to what I was saying earlier about the show demonstrating a perspective on the drug war or whatever you want to call it, that may not be considered by the average viewer, and this idea that drug dealers might use business sense and have an idea of marketing and whatnot. They're just not just getting a product and selling it idly. Like they can do it in sort of clever, shrewd, business-like ways that people would associate with other normal businesses. And this is also picked up on by McNulty, who talks about why can't you just sell this shit and walk the fuck away like every other industry in this town? And Stringer's obviously showing the opening stages of that to us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's strange how Stringer doesn't get really much screen time at all in season 1, because it's almost his learning season. It's kind of building him up to become the businessman that he kind of embodies throughout seasons 2 and 3. And it's nice that they give us this little intro to the whole money side, the whole business side of the drugs here.
Yeah.
You mentioned the McNulty referring to the drug trade as kind of just another business, which I thought was nice, because that was from the interrogation scene from episode 2, right?
Yeah. Why can't you just sell the shit and walk the fuck away?
That's it. And there's kind of a nice continuation of that scene at the start of this episode, with D'Angelo sort of telling his Wallace, Bodie, and Poot. Where is it? Sorry, yeah. So he's telling them, why can't you just move on? It's kind of like he's taken that straight from the interrogation, and it shows that they're. But the problem is that Poot, Wallace, and Bodie can't understand why it has to be that way, because their ingrained understanding of the roles drug addicts play in their society is kind of reinforced. So they struggle to comprehend the idea that their customer base, in an ideal world, should be treated with respect. So for them, because they're dope fiends, they are what they are, and they should be treated with contempt.
Yeah.
And it's another nice look into D'Angelo's understanding of compassion, and not the ingrained idea of people playing their roles. I think it's funny enough, because the actual reason that they gave was because they're dope fiends. Literally nothing beyond that. Because they're dope fiends, they deserve to be shat on, basically. So
it's interesting that Bodhi is willing to be, along. It's almost like a sort of level of traditionalism. Like, that's the way it is. It's just because that's the way they are, and thus we shouldn't treat them with any respect. But when it comes to the sort of incorrigible nature of the game in relation to the chess scene, he doesn't see it the same way. He sees it as it can be manipulated.
Yeah.
And the two kind of, sit at odds with each other there. Like, he sees the chess game and he's like, well, there's got to be a way around it if you're smart or whatever. You can subvert this system. But in relation to drug fiends, he's not going to be moved. That's just the way it is and it's not going to change.
Yeah.
It's kind of like sort of conflict of interest.
No, definitely. I think it's also good in these early episodes to see how much D'Angelo and Bodhi disagree with each other on kind of every aspect of life.
Yeah.
Even in... it feels really spoilery to say this, but I'm sure everyone has seen the show.
Hey, we outlined the spoiler thing already. Anyone who's listened to this should know what they let themselves in for.
Okay. Just in case you haven't, the next 5 seconds may be quite spoilery, but when Bodhi goes to buy flowers for D'Angelo's funeral, he even, he says he wasn't much of a guy, but we've still got to buy him some flowers. Like he didn't appreciate D'Angelo's way of doing things, and despite that, they're still heralded characters. Both of them are absolutely loved by the community, and I think it just kind of shows how it's less about what the person believes in, but more kind of how they carry themselves. So, because Bodhi was so committed to his beliefs and the idea that he could work his way up, and he was committed to that kind of job role, everyone kind of loved him for it. And his eventual death at the end of season 4 was like much lamented, as was D'Angelo's, which was perhaps even more tragic. But I think it's important to pull out that distance between the two characters of Bodhi and D'Angelo, who really didn't get on from the start.
And you're also saying that a lot of the popularity levels for certain characters is based not on like their moral compass or the actions that they take, but rather their attitude towards the world around them.
Absolutely, that's a far more a well-delivered way of putting it. Yeah,
because are you saying that? Well, I guess maybe I think I would agree with this. This is what you're saying. Like there are characters in The Wire who, seem to be well loved, but to me, like there are very good reasons to not like them.
Yeah.
And like you say, Bodhi is one of them. I think, especially later on, for me personally, Omar becomes one of them. Like people love Omar, but I don't know, I'm a bit hot and cold with Omar as a character. We'll obviously discuss this more as the seasons go along, but
yeah, no, he is heralded. I know on all the best character show polls for the show. Omar generally comes out on top.
I don't think I would ever, if I had to formulate like a top 5 characters, I don't think I would put Omar in it.
No, I completely agree.
But that's for later episodes. We'll have to go into this later.
We'll come back to this, as tempting as it is.
I also will come back to that. We will come back to that chess analogy as well, because that is subtly demonstrated in a couple of other places, not just in this season, but in much later seasons as well. So we will definitely be returning to that discussion point.
Yeah,
I think
there's plenty of scenes where people start playing chess, isn't there? Like when people are vulnerable to authority, which is really nice, and I'm sure we can identify a few of those on our way through the show. We've talked about Stan Valchek, didn't we? There's also another character introduced from the police, Bobby Reed, who's major of the IID, the Internal Investigations Division.
Yeah.
And so he plays a very small role throughout the show. But there are a few scenes where his power to pull strings at the request of Burrell do have significant consequences for the detail and other characters. And in the scene at the start, he's the one who's carried out the investigation into the blinding of the kid. And we see that he used the witnesses' criminal histories as a justification for coming down on a no brutality charge for Perez.
Yeah. We see that in the first steps in the first scene, more or less, or the second scene, I think it is.
That's right, straight after the credits. So we see from the start that he's a bit of a piece of shit. And I think it kind of speaks to the idea that if you have any... Well, first of all, the 2 a.m. field interviews actually worked quite a lot in Daniels' favour, because he ended up with no loss of personnel, apart from perhaps Herc for a week of medical.
Who comes back for the raid anyway. So
he's too desperate to bust some heads anyway that he just throws himself out of hospital and comes back anyway. Yeah.
Although arguably Daniels gives that to him because he's lost McNulty and he's kind of feeling pissed off. So he's just like he's in a bit of a like fuck it situation. Yeah. He just wants to get it over and done with. Like he knows it's shit, but he just wants to do it. Like.
Absolutely.
This is another great Daniels episode, by the way. When we talk a little bit more later on about favourite characters, this is another really strong Daniels episode.
Oh, definitely, yeah. There's another, as we saw last time, that the Daniels rants this time at McNulty is just so good. It's just so intense. Like, you don't doubt him for 1 second that he's extremely pissed off. But we just to finish that off, what we were saying about the what was it again? So Przebylewski.
You were talking about Valchek and the introduction of.
That's right. So
what's his thing? I've forgotten his name.
Bobby Reed.
Bobby Reed. That's it.
Yeah. So following this, you have Valchek, who's in charge of Baltimore's Southeastern District, and all Wire fans will know that he becomes a much bigger role, or he develops a much bigger role from season 2.
And he doesn't become a nicer person. Oh,
absolutely not. He is one of the biggest pieces of film.
Valchek learns nothing in The Wire.
Yeah, but what he has learned is very effective at keeping him pretty. So
he's learned everything he needs to know to be as effective as he wants to be.
Yeah, I respect him in a way that I respect Levy. Levy's one of the people I respect most in the show because of how damn good he is as a lawyer.
Yeah,
and like the show really goes lengths to show you that he's really mastered his craft. But if you remember from last episode, a couple of characters spoke about Przebylewski's 9 lives. I think Rhonda was one of them, and then there was the other kind of lieutenant that Daniels was speaking to. And we see that because Prez is important to people in high places, bad things actually have benefits. So Daniels now has suction with a police major, with the promise of additional resources should he need it.
Yeah.
And it just kind of speaks to the idea that just a number of situations where broken department reliant on cover-ups consistently rewards the wrongdoers, and it kind of pays off the concern that Daniels had throughout last episode, where he was always the rump without the tit, i.e. had no suction up the chain.
Yeah. That
would help him to go around the system to get things done, and this scene kind of puts that into place and gives him that little suction. So you could also, my last point here is that you could also say this scene's very important because it lays a foundation for the reuniting of the detail in season 2, because the detail is only ever brought back together because Valchek knew Daniels from before and knew that he was a competent organizer of people, an effective leader. So I think that the scene actually has a lot more kind of importance than it may first appear. So
that's kind of like a micro game within the police departments, isn't it? The gaining suction and gaining political power, and being able to favours for favours. Like that's kind of the game within the police department.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just a case of seeing who's in whose pocket and what that can get you.
I also wanted to. There's a couple of small things I wanted to talk about as well. I think we briefly touched on this in the last episode about the diegetic music and the use of music in general in The Wire. There's a very clear shot of a boombox just before the scene where Sydney and Bubbles go and do their buys. And it's just really sort of highlighting that The Wire consistently ensures that sources of music are diegetic, and that is to say that they come from somewhere within the world of the show itself. I think there is one exception, which is when Avon and Stringer return to the pit at one point, and there's a bit of non-diegetic music there. It's literally like sort of underscore music. But generally speaking, The Wire sticks to its guns. So we hear music from radios, we hear music from boomboxes, from MP3 players, things like that. So it's kind of an interesting aspect of the show, sticking to its guns on that realism front.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
For example, we hear McNulty listening to the Pogues, who, if you're paying attention, show up quite a few times with McNulty. So we learn that it's obviously a favourite band of his, them being Irish as well. I get to talk about music for a bit, yay!
Definitely. No, it's a good point. Again, you brought up that boombox. I'd always looked at it as a good scene, but I'd never really thought of it as a way of justifying the music. Yeah. I mean, as you say, just in case anyone did think that they decided to plant a soundtrack in, here's a boombox to let you know that they haven't.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a nice
look,
observation.
Authenticity. Look at it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's screaming authenticity, and yeah, a nice observation from Music Man.
The continued gap, the continued wealth inequality between the FBI and the Baltimore Police Department is obviously shown quite a few times in these early episodes. For example, we see it here when they tried to get hold of the undercover recorder for Sydney. Like, McNulty actually does the whole thing where you blow the dust off it. Like, that's such a kind of cliche, but he does do it anyway. And they have these
you have no doubt that
tape recorders that are just completely unworkable.
Yeah.
But there's another really subtle use of it later on, where the two, in the final scene, in fact, where the two meet up and Fitzhugh tells McNulty about Daniel's dirty past and whatnot. There's a really nice use of it there as well, because Fitzhugh's window is an electric window and McNulty's is a manual one.
That's nice.
So he puts the window down and McNulty has to roll it down. I thought that was a kind of a nice little demonstration of the, continued wealth inequality between the two.
Yeah, definitely.
In terms of assets, anyway.
Yeah, and then of course Fitzhugh doesn't actually know how to communicate through a car.
Yeah.
Showing that perhaps when it comes to actual practical street knowledge, he's the lesser of the two men.
They've got the money, they got the gear and the games and the toys, but not necessarily the street smarts.
Yeah, definitely. Well, what did you think of that scene, by the way? I remember
which rolls down the hill further, by the way, when we see Bubbles demonstrating more street smarts still to Sydney.
Yes.
So you kind of see these levels of knowledge.
Yeah, it just absolutely speaks to the...
ties into what you were saying about the overall theme.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned that Fitzhugh scene at the end. I remember really enjoying that the first time around. I was like, it's a great cliffhanger. Because I felt like Daniels, they were building him up as almost the main character. Like, as you say, this episode, he was a very important piece as well.
That would have been an interesting direction, actually.
Yeah, absolutely, because he is, I think, by far the most, along with D'Angelo, the most empathetic character at the start, or the most sympathetic. And when they throw you that curveball of the dirt, you kind of go, oh crap! Like, this has really changed the way I'm thinking about the show here. It's almost a shame that it never really comes to play a huge role. But I think as an initial cliffhanger, it's great. Like, it's
quite a tease.
Being really kind of yeah, definitely.
I think for McNulty, there's a certain satisfaction in it because, he's getting told off by this boss who wants to keep him clean and keep him sort of, not being insubordinate. But he learns that Daniels is not as much of the model officer as he may appear. Yeah, I think McNulty's got to take a bit of, sick pleasure from that.
So it reinforces his self-informed authority on the matter anyway, doesn't it? So, yeah.
There's another sort of interesting moment with McNulty that does kind of pay off in a way, where he's with Kima. Actually, another thing, McNulty and Kima, they kind of sort of allies established in this episode. It seems like they kind of have a stronger friendship gathering together in this episode.
Yeah.
And
definitely.
in the scene where they're talking about, McNulty says, "What have you got to do to get? I wonder what you've got to do to get kicked out of the police." And Kima says, "Keep doing what you're doing, and you'll find out." Now, obviously, especially in season 5, we see that really coming into fruition. But McNulty still doesn't really get kicked out. We never actually see him, actually get kicked out. So, the answer to McNulty's question is, we don't know. Who knows what it takes to get kicked out of the police force?
Yeah, so they completely rely on cover-ups.
It just demonstrates so much, like, how, I don't want to get sort of really political in here, but it does demonstrate how it's a serious, genuine problem. Like, police departments constantly protecting everything that goes on within it, being somewhat above the law in a way. If it's demonstrated well in this program, and there are plenty of examples of it in the real world, it just demonstrates the show's ability to portray that in a way that doesn't seem, kind of laughable, or having to use characters that are caricatures, basically.
Yeah,
It's able to put forth those values and those offered perspectives in a way that feels tasteful.
yeah, absolutely. You spoke about the McNulty and Greg's relationship developing.
Yes, they seem to get a lot closer in this episode. Seem to find some common ground.
Yeah, it's nice occasionally. I think particularly at the start there was so little in the way of personal scenes. It was all so professional, and it was all building towards this, this goal of catching the drug dealers. That it's nice to have some sort of personal chat about, just how many kids you got, or
the show was running the risk of becoming a bit cold if it kept that up.
Yeah, so it's one of those few lapses where you just see him sort of have a little chat, really, which is nice.
And now a human being scene.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's kind of what they're going for, particularly because you do see the personal lives of these police officers, but it is few and far between. I think the show does get better at showing more of it later on. But I was speaking in terms of those relationships. I identified quite a few that developed this episode. So you already mentioned Santangelo and Rawls, who this is almost the first time we see Rawls be a reasonable person, as he has found someone who he can almost manipulate into being his little eyes and ears.
Reasonable but not ethical.
Reasonable but not ethical. So you get a sense that Rawls is able to, stop blowing a gasket occasionally and actually speak like a human being to some people. You also have Bodie, D'Angelo, and his crew bonding over not only chess but also the morality of the drug game. You have Daniels and Valchek, as we discussed recently, with the whole idea of suction. And then D'Angelo and Chardine, I believe, have a small development at Orlando's. Is that right?
I was going to talk a little bit about that when we come to talk about the title.
Oh,
so
okay.
I'll save that.
Yeah. Okay,
I have two more.
I'll save my take on it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I have two more very small things, both potential cameos of characters in later seasons. There is a shot just before we see Lester Freeman go into the boxing club, of a kid stood, just a kind of street kid stood on a stoop or something at night time. It looks exactly like a young Michael, who appears, most prominently in season 4. And I've stopped it and looked at it, and it looks so much like a young Michael. It's got to be him. I refuse to believe that they would put a shot like that in that is so deliberate, and we don't see this kid again. There's no major reason for that shot to even be there, but it's so kind of pointed at this kid, and it looks so much like Michael that I am convinced that that's what it is. And later on, in fact, no, it's actually before that. We see the conference where Rawls and Bunker explaining about Gant and obviously rejecting that it was to do with him being a state's witness. But I'm pretty sure that we see some cameos from season 5 news reporters, members of the Baltimore Sun. And I've forgotten his name now. It begins with Z. That's
right. Bill Zorzi.
Zorzi, that's it.
He actually plays himself, so his name in real life is Will Zorzi. And I think he screen wrote for The Wire throughout all of it. And he was obviously a fairly prominent character in season 5 in the newspaper office. But yeah, as you say, he definitely has a little cameo here. And it's really nice to see that continuity has gone all the way back to the start.
Yeah, it's the seasons aren't isolated from one another.
Yeah,
it's not like season 1, season 2. It's more just kind of like it is a contiguous world, and it goes back and forth as well. I mean, we see characters from season 2 in season 5, for example.
Yeah, the homeless stevedores, which is a really nice callback.
It's incredibly sad, but it's also a really sort of beautiful callback. I think it's really well done there.
Yeah,
really depressing.
Definitely, but yeah, it does, because I think season 2 had the problem of feeling too much like it was its own little boat.
But what a boat!
But what a boat it was, and it was good that they found ways to connect it more up with everything else. I think season 5 perhaps has a little bit of a cameo and episode feel from previous seasons, but there are some really nice ones, because you get Nick Sobotka as well, don't you?
Yeah.
Who makes a little vocal appearance.
Maybe a token
Yeah.
gesture just to bring season 2 back into the picture a little bit. Because I know what you mean. It does feel like if any season is isolated, it is season 2 because it is very, very different from all the others in terms of theme, in terms of characters, in terms of lots of different things.
It's only once they bring back the Greek and Vondus, like I think that's towards the end of season 4, that it feels like okay, everything that we watched in season 2 is kind of worth it because we know what these guys get up to and we know what they're capable of. And we know exactly what knowing these guys means for the drug dealers. So it really, you understand by the end why season 2 is so important. Because I think that's a common gripe that a lot of first-time viewers have. That season 2 is like, what's the point, man? What's the point? So,
right. Do you want to jump into the title and the epigraph then?
So how do you get to be the king? It ain't like that. See, the king, stay the king. All right. Everything stay who he is, except for the pawns.
The buys, again, basic. Sidner and Bubbles literally buy drugs in the ghetto.
Yeah.
And the various drug deals around the low-rises are carried out. I think there are a few other instances of like non-financial purchases.
You could perhaps say
I'm
Rawls
sure.
is buying Santangelo's loyalty with favours.
Definitely, yeah. So he buys his eyes and ears in exchange for kind of being in his good books, and he'll give him a few little, rubs here and there, probably, whatever that means. And then I guess the vow check, buying his son-in-law's immunity through making nice with Daniels, is another big one.
Yeah, right at the start. There's also D'Angelo ends up buying Chardine a drink, which obviously he rejected to do the first time.
Yes.
But it's an interesting show because he talks about, I think it's in the previous episode, he's talking about finding a place for him and Donette and their kid. So he kind of shows himself as like this kind of family man. And then he goes to Orlando's and basically, pays a stripper, and we don't really see where that progresses to, but I think we can, we've all got a good enough imagination.
Yeah, no, definitely.
So that's kind of an interesting buy as well.
Yeah, definitely. Are there any others you can think of?
No, that's all. I mean, maybe Stringer talking about drug fiends and saying that they're going to buy it no matter what.
Yeah,
they're going to buy twice as much. In fact, Bodhi says at one point, about buying twice as much and getting half as high.
Yeah. And preceding that scene that you talked about with Chardine, Stringer tells D'Angelo to buy something he wouldn't otherwise with the extra bonus.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And that's when he goes to buy that drink for Chardine, which is a really nice kind of logic to it. So,
which I guess is something that he wouldn't do otherwise, as demonstrated.
As demonstrated by his attitude towards her in episode 1, I guess.
Exactly,
yeah. So that leaves the epigraph and our favourite scene.
Yes, very important scene for The Wire. Just a kind of mini analogy for itself.
Yeah.
So the epigraph itself is, the king stay the king, says D'Angelo, as he teaches Wallace and Bodhi the ins and outs of chess. There are a lot... It sounds like a cliche, but there are, many levels to this analogy. If you want to kickstart your thoughts on it first, Toby.
I guess I see the epigraph really as our intro to The Wire's big metaphor, the chess. And the chess scene itself was like the first scene I ever saw of The Wire. Tom, our good friend Tom, who introduced me to the show, told me, he just sent me a link to this scene, and I think a lot of people use it as their way in. And
Tom is Tom Quee, by the way.
Tom Quee, who we may or may not have guesting at some point.
Yeah, we're possibly going to have him on the show at some point. It would be nice to have him because he's very knowledgeable about The Wire. And he's a sort of spoken word performance artist friend of ours. So hopefully you'll be hearing his voice, his Brummie accent at some point. If you hear Brummie accents and wordplay, then Tom Quee is on the show. Hello, Tom.
He'll be here before we know it, yeah.
He's probably listening to this. You were saying.
Yes. As I was saying, so I guess the King Stay the King, that's really a direct reference to Avon. And it's something that's explored throughout seasons 2 and 3 with him, really. and I guess it's just there's nothing too much to dig with the epigraph. I don't think it's just a case of it being the key quote of the chess metaphor: "The king stay the king." And in this case, Avon is very well insulated, and doesn't look like anytime soon he's going to be arrested or killed or reach any other ugly ending. So for me, it just sort of speaks to the chess metaphor in general, and Avon's got the world by the balls, and of course that does speak to the whole idea of institutions in general, with Burrell at the top, etc. But then again, Burrell is a slave to the system itself, so it becomes more complex when you look at it like that. But that's kind of my take on it. What about you?
The epigraph relates to a lot of very interesting things, which is what's so great about it. I mean, it is obviously very simple, and obviously it invokes the chess game. It obviously invokes Avon. In relation to that, Avon does not appear in this episode. You know, the king stay the king. He's the most important factor, and we don't see him for the whole thing. So much of the episode is focused around him. You know, they're trying to find the photo of him. They start busting down doors as if it's going to find him. You know, he doesn't appear in this episode at all. Which is, you know, obviously interesting. And I was also going to add, maybe the quote itself is not the show referencing itself about trying to be on top as a show as well, because in relation to the chess scene, I was going to mention this earlier, we see that they're playing checkers on it before, and you could argue that they're playing checkers, which is a simpler game. They don't know how to play chess, and they don't originally they don't seem to care much to learn either. They just want to stick with their checkers, and they're, you know, playing it all wrong, as it were. And D'Angelo comes along and shows them how to do it properly, and demonstrates that although it is more complex and harder to grapple with, it is at the same time more rewarding, and kind of there's, you know, it's a much more in-depth kind of game. That could be interpreted as The Wire demonstrating itself against other cop shows, whereby there is a format, there is this simpler version, the checkers, or you can have something with a lot more depth that's harder to get into. You have to understand, you know, the rules or the format, and that's The Wire. Yeah, that's a possible interpretation.
That's very nice. Yeah. So if The Wire is so bold to talk about itself, I think that's certainly quite a valid reading of it. Definitely.
And when, you know, the king stay the king, I mean, in terms of what it does as a show, The Wire stays the king.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be any time soon that it's going to be threatened for its quality. So yeah, that's my take on the epigraph. Excellent. No, it's a nice take. I guess that just leaves us to do our. Have we got a character and scene? Are those the last two categories?
Yeah, we can throw in some favourites. For favourite character, I think I'm going to have to go for Daniels again, because this is another great Daniels episode. We see more of his intensity. We see more. I mean, Lance Reddick, who plays Daniels, does an excellent job of demonstrating just how serious he is when he gets angry with people. Like, you just don't want to mess with him. I just think it's a great performance. And we see Daniels constantly kind of going around this loop of trying to do well, but also playing the system to his advantage as and when he can. Like, he's still not totally detached in the same way that someone like McNulty is, where he's being obviously openly insubordinate. In that scene where we see McNulty and Daniels having a bit of an argument about that, Daniels still tries to get him to sign the sick note so he can justify it to his higher-ups. Like, he's still trying to play that political element, and we see him learning that getting suction from Valchek is something else that can play into his hands later on. So he's trying to do well, but he's also, you know, he's conflicted, and it's an interesting portrayal of the character, and still another really strong episode for Daniels, I think.
Excellent. Yeah. For me, I go kind of for the yin of that yang with McNulty. So for me, it's kind of a standout week for him so far. I think this week really shows that indicates that he's going to be a lot more than your standard cop protagonist. and there's 3 scenes with McNulty this time that really kind of, I think, particularly good for him. The one where he puts Polk and Mahone in their places for being the laziest shits in the department.
Not that they learn anything.
No, not that they do, but I think it's a nice moment for McNulty to kind of instill his superiority in that room, and that also feeds into Kima, where she goes bonding with McNulty and Bubbles, and it's a nice insight into all 3 of them that we haven't really experienced so far in this very corporate world that they've built. And finally, we have as you've just been referencing, the Daniels versus McNulty face-off at the end. Very intense and brilliantly acted on both accounts. I don't know whether I prefer McNulty or Daniels in the scene, but I think they're both very strong. And we see here that McNulty is never willing to compromise his beliefs, and that his rejection of the chain of command is kind of a consistent vice that's going to define him throughout the show, really. In
fact, it just gets worse as time goes on, really.
Exactly, yeah. So he's the ultimate self-destructor. So for me, I'll go with McNulty. I don't think I'll probably be ever going for McNulty again, because it almost feels like too obvious a choice. But in this case, because of the developments we see with him, it's quite good. And of course, the Rhonda Perlman scene was great as well. And we kind of we get that the pager intercept law scene was nice. So
that wasn't all he was going there for.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. So we get a sense of how things with his wife.
He wanted to beep her as well.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot more to that scene than May First Meet the Eye.
Right, I think that's episode 3 then.
Is that almost favourite scene?
Oh yes, I suppose we can do a favourite scene as well. I do really like the Stringer scene. I know we've already talked about it. It's sort of a tie between that and the undercover scene with Sydney and kind of what leads up to it. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a tie between those two, I think, for me. The undercover scene with Sydney is nice. It kind of demonstrates all those street smarts and what he's learned, and it's quite exciting. It's quite a fun feeling scene in a way, because there's so many shots of just people sitting around the pit. We get a real kind of like atmosphere of the pit from that scene, which is great. It's just kind of like an atmosphere piece, but with the Stringer scene, it's just really kind of heavy on the character, and we see a lot of Stringer the businessman and kind of what it sets him up for the rest of the season. And obviously D'Angelo getting a bit of credit, even though it may not have actually been all that deserved.
Yeah, very nice.
Between those two,
for me, it would have been the Sydney setup scheme. So the one where Bubbles is schooling them. In the detail room. I think it's great. It gives us a lot of respect for Bubbles, and as I was saying earlier, I think it's just a great insight into how the drug world has its own distinct nuances and cultural norms that the show wants to show us. And that these then become, there's something that are very alien to not just the viewers but the detail as well, and we get a chance to look into that and see how it really is quite complex. And I just found that fascinating. So for me, that definitely wins out. But the Stringer scene with the money is, I think, a close second. So does that cover everything for this week? Is that our
I think it does, yeah.
Done?
It just leaves us to say that thank you for joining us again. And obviously, every Friday we'll be putting out a new episode. And don't forget to check out the website at caughtonthewire.wordpress.com, and our email. There's a contact form on the website, but you can also email us directly at caughtonthewire@gmail.com. And unless is there anything else you want to add before we finish up?
Not at all. No, I think we've that's a very comprehensive discussion. So thanks for listening again, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks again. Bye.
What you know about Baltimore? What you know about Baltimore? Baltimore. What you know about Baltimore? What you know about Baltimore? Baltimore. What you